Hola y'all, welcome back to my channel. So this is Shelly Flowers Reads and Writes. I am Michelle Flores, and here I like to talk about all things related to reading and writing. Now, this is a video that I have been working on for a few weeks now. I actually got this idea from a user, so shout out to them for giving me the idea to come up with this video. And this video is going to be about something that I have noticed come up a lot in conversation when it comes to poetry in the AuthorTube and BookTube space. And that is how to read a poem. Now, here's the thing that I've noticed. Whenever people talk about poetry on this platform, 99% of the time, they talk about how much they don't like poetry. And the main reason why people struggle to understand poetry is because they just don't know how to read it. That's basically what it boils down to. A lot of people feel like when they read a poem, it just doesn't make sense to them, and therefore they don't like it. It makes complete sense. I think so much of this is due to the fact that when poetry is taught in schools, we focus so much on arbitrary rhetorical and literary and figurative devices that we miss the meaning and the emotion of a poem and focus solely on the mechanics of a poem. I don't teach poetry in this way, and the book that I am currently reading right now actually has some really great suggestions on how to read poetry. Here is that book. It is called Poetry, A Writer's Guide and Anthology. I have just started reading this book. I'm only on chapter 7 so far, but I have to be honest, this is by far one of the best craft books of poetry that I have ever read. I think it definitely starts from a place of a beginner, but it also doesn't talk down to its reader. It has this amazing ability to provide real quick chunks and snapshots of basic building blocks you need to understand when it comes to poetry, and it does look at it through the lens of a writer. But I think even as someone who is just interested in understanding how to read poetry, this would be a great guide. The chapter that I'm primarily pulling from is actually chapter 6, which is Rhetorical Construction. So, and you can see I have it all tabbed up here. This book essentially posits that all poems are rhetorical arguments, and I think that's a genius way to think about poetry. So what does that actually mean? Well, a rhetorical argument is basically any form of writing or speaking in which the speaker or the author is trying to convince you of something. Now, I don't necessarily believe that all poems are trying to get you to go out and do a specific action, but I do believe that all poems want you to view the world, at least of that poem, in the speaker's lens. And let's talk about what I actually mean by that. So when we talk about rhetoric, there's 3 main things that we need to keep in mind. You have logos, which is an appeal to logic. You have pathos, which is an appeal to your emotions. And you also have ethos, which is an appeal to your ethics or your moral character. These 3 things work together in a triangle in any form of primarily nonfiction or argumentative writing, but poems function in the same way. And it's really interesting because in my own classroom, I teach middle school English. I teach my students to read poems through this same lens. So I'm going to use the sort of framework that this book posits, and together we're going to break down one of my favorite poems that is so simple but really packs a punch. The poem that we're going to be reading is called In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound. This poem is only 2 lines. And it's essentially like Ezra Pound's take on a haiku. It doesn't follow the 5-7-5 format because that's not necessarily what a haiku is about. Instead, a haiku primarily focuses on taking an element of nature to understand the world at large. And that comes through in this poem. So in my own classroom, whenever we read poems, we read them at least 3 times. The first time we read it is for the logos, the literal meaning of the poem. What do we see happening on the page? We don't dive into it. We don't try to dissect it. We don't try to understand it. We just look and see what happened. The second step that I take is the pathos portion, or the emotional connection. Now, writers, especially poets, build emotional connections through two methods. They focus on figurative language and sound devices, basically any kind of tricks of the trade to get readers emotionally invested in the piece. So some examples of this: metaphors, similes, personification. That's your figurative language. Sound devices would be alliteration, constantly repeating the same sound at the beginning of the word, or a rhyme scheme. All of these work together to create an emotional cadence within the poem. The other way that they build that emotional cadence, though, is through imagery. We should also be looking at white space. And I think that's what we really see in this poem, but we'll get to that in just a second. The third reading that we do is to focus on ethos, or the thematic meaning of the poem. Now, when I teach theme in my classroom, I teach theme as being the lesson or the moral that the author is trying to get us as readers to understand. So when you start looking at a poem through these three lenses, it helps you break it down in a way that makes it make more sense. And in class, I literally give my students printouts of the poems. Yes, my paper use is outrageous, but that's a hill I'm willing to die on because I think it's important for their comprehension. So on the left-hand side of the page, we always take notes on the literal meaning of the poem. On the right-hand side of the page, we always take notes on the figurative language and imagery that's being used. And then the bottom of the poem, at the end of it, that's where we put the thematic meaning. I didn't make up this technique. I actually learned it at a workshop from a school in Boston, so I cannot take credit for this. But as someone who has studied poetry, I think it's sort of like an innate thing that all poets tend to do as we read poems. We read through these three lenses. It's reading in this way that can help you understand the overall meaning that a poet's trying to get across. So let's practice. That was sort of like our intro to new material for any teachers that might be watching. Now let's practice. Here's our guided practice. So here we have our poem, In a Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. That's it. So let's start off with our logos, our literal meaning. Well, literally, we just have people waiting in a train station, and we have a bough that's covered in petals, and it's kind of wet. First reading. We stop there. We don't try to go deeper. We need to read it again. Side note with poetry, read it out loud. I think a lot of people try to just do it in their head, and that also trips you up. Poets keep in mind that they will probably be performing these poems, and so they write with that experience in mind a lot of the time. So here's our second reading. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. All right, there's a couple things happening here. So the first thing I notice is the comparison that's being made. We could call this a metaphor. We could call this an analogy, but there's a comparison happening here. And I notice these faces that are waiting for their train are being compared to petals, like flower petals on a bough from a tree, like a branch. So I'm noticing that the author wants us to make this connection between these two ideas, this like people commuting to work and then looking at a tree. So when we look at this poem, it was written like this on purpose. These words are spaced out in a very odd way. And so if I want to look at the pathos meaning of it, I'm noticing there's just separations between these chunks of words. And then that makes me think, what's Ezra saying about the ways in which humans interact with each other, or the ways in which humans interact with nature? I don't really know what that means yet though. So I'm gonna read it one more time just to solidify my understanding. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Thematically, the deeper meaning or the moral that I think Ezra is trying to get across in this poem is that he's trying to show us nature and the city, they're probably not that different. And if we take some time to just really look at the people around us, we could build this deeper connection to the worlds that we're living in. I can't necessarily talk to Ezra Pound and prove that. This is more based off the impression that I'm getting as I read this. The thing with poetry is that it's less about being right and more about how you feel. So when I read this poem, it forces me to stay still, and it forces me to look at details. It forces me to slow down. And I think that's the message that Ezra wants to get across. So this is just an intro into how to read a poem. This is what I do with my students, and we practice this constantly. Every time we read a poem, we do this. It gets to the point where by the end of the year, they're able to do this automatically. Immediately, they're looking for literal, figurative, and thematic meanings every time they go through a poem. And that's really where you want to be as a reader of poetry. You want to make sure that you're able to pull out those different forms of meaning at the same time, because you want this to be an all-encompassing experience. Or the Artisan Geek did a really great video about how to read a book of poetry. So I'm going to link that in the description below, because I think she said it in a way that I really agree with. When you read poetry, you want it to just wash over you, and you want to pull out the impression that you're getting from the text. I think too often we view logic as meaning it has to have a clear linear argument, and poems don't always do that. Instead, when we think about logic, and this is what the book, Poetry, A Writer's Guide and Anthology, this is what that book basically tries to tell us, is that it's not about logic in the world as we know it, but the logic that the author is creating in the poem. And I will also say, any poems that you come across, Google and see if there's a performance of it. Chances there are. Either it's the author themselves performing it or a fan of the author's work who's performing it. But I think it's so important to listen to these poems out loud. It's almost like reading a book of plays versus watching a play. Yeah, you can kind of get a meaning from reading the play, but it's not going to compare to the meaning that you get when you actually watch the play on stage. So, with all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a comment, like, and subscribe. Your homework, I want you to try and do this with a different poem. If you're not sure where to start, I've linked some of my favorite poems down below, a good mix of classic and modern poets. Please go ahead and read those. Follow these 3 steps, figure out what meaning and what feeling are you getting when you're done with the poem. Let me know in the comments down below. All right, guys, I post videos every Wednesday and Sunday, sometimes Friday. You can find me on Instagram, Tumblr, Goodreads, and now Twitter at Shelly Flowers. If you'd like to buy a book of poetry by me, Cuentos from the Swamp, it's a book of poetry all about growing up in South Florida, go ahead and check out the link below. Ciao, y'all.